This is Module 13, Lesson 3. Now it's time for us to look at some other types of mixtures that include water. This time we're looking at heterogeneous systems, which remember from Module 2, heterogeneous means that you can tell the parts apart in these particular types of mixtures. The first one that we're going to talk about for just a second is suspensions. Remember that suspensions, they're capable of settling. They are heterogeneous because you can see the pieces. They have very large particles compared to solution, and since the particles are so large, they can be easily filtered. Whereas our solutions in the previous lesson, they were not able to be filtered because the particles are so small that they would all go through a filter. The next type of heterogeneous system is called a colloid. Colloids are kind of in a world in between solutions and suspensions. They kind of have medium-sized particles. And the deal with the colloids is that the particles aren't so large that they settle out, but they're also not so small that you can't see them. They're in between. There are lots of examples listed right here for you. I won't read all of them because you can read them. So, keep in mind that they have the medium-sized particles. And how you can tell the difference between a solution and a suspension and a colloid, part of it is the Tyndall effect. So I have a picture right here of the Tyndall effect. This right here, this beam of light that you can see going through this particular mixture is called the Tyndall effect. It's the scattering of light that happens by the particles in colloids and also in suspensions. Notice in this one, it's lit up. You can see right here where the light beam is hitting the beaker, and you can kind of see on this other end where it comes out, but you don't have this delineated beam of light that's going through the middle of it like you do with the beaker on the right. So, excuse me, if you see the Tyndall effect like this, it's either a colloid or a suspension. How you could ultimately tell is if you gave it enough time, the colloid would stay just like this. The suspension would settle. You would see your heavier particles either floating to the top or settling to the bottom. They wouldn't remain suspended in solution. All right, so a little bit more about colloids here. Brownian motion is what keeps the colloid particles in suspension, basically. It's just the chaotic movement of them. They collide into each other and they keep going. Since they're not heavy enough, they're not large enough, gravity won't separate them and pull them down. A little bit more about colloids is the word coagulation. To coagulate basically means to clump together, kind of like to clot. So you can coagulate a colloid. If you use certain chemicals, you can cause the colloid to clump together and to settle out. This is commonly done in your house with an ionizing air filter. Basically it's the idea right here of what it's talking about here is you use ions to charge the surface of the colloid particles, for example, dust. And what that does is it causes them to ultimately clump together, and then they'll be heavy enough that they can actually fall and settle out. Keeping on with the colloids, we have emulsions. Emulsions are basically colloidal dispersions of a liquid in a liquid. Ideally, these things would never mix. Mayonnaise and greasy water are two great examples. Mayonnaise is made by a mixture of vinegar and oil. They would not mix on their own. If you put the two together, they would, if you had a container like this, they would simply form two layers. You would see one on top of the other. So what you do to make a colloidal dispersion like this is you add an emulsifier. Egg happens to be the emulsifier that's used to make mayonnaise, and what you do when the egg goes in is the egg basically holds on and takes the vinegar and the oil and says, "You're coming with me." So part of the egg grabs a hold of the vinegar, part of the egg grabs a hold of the oil, and now they are together. Greasy water is another example. We all know that oil or grease and water, they don't mix because this oil and grease are very nonpolar. Water is very polar. However, if you add soap or a detergent to this mixture, for example, dish detergent, what it does is it basically has a polar end and a nonpolar end. The polar end loves the water, the nonpolar end loves the grease, So the soap works as the go-between that's able to hang on to both, and it takes them together. That's the idea of an emulsifier. There's other types of emulsifiers. If you get into kitchen chemistry or the chemistry of cooking, you'll see that there's quite a few things that can be commonly used as emulsifiers. Egg is a common one with cooking, but others have some kind of funky names that you might see on the backs of labels. Alright, with that being said, it's a very quick video. It's time for you to have some practice. I have quite a few things on your practice sheet that ask you to look at identifying if something are colloids, suspensions, or solutions. You may find that you have to do a little bit of research to answer some of those, and that's acceptable. No problem with that since you don't have a textbook in your possession. And you know that if all else fails, you can take a stab at it and the answers will be released to you after the fact, so you can go back and check your work. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll be happy to help you during office hours.